Greetings, and welcome to this fourth lecture in a series of 5 lectures on the subject of extemporaneous preaching. In these last 2 lectures, I'm going to be focusing on the process of writing a sermon. I believe that writing a sermon that is going to be spoken extemporaneously involves 2 very creative processes. The first, of course, is writing. This is where the sermon is created. But the second process, when we speak it freely, is also a creative process, as we've discovered, as we've talked about it in the last few lectures. So you have 2 very creative processes going on: the writing of the sermon and then the preaching of the sermon. And writing is very important. It's really the most important thing, because if you haven't written something, then you don't have anything to share with the congregation. So writing becomes the most important part, but speaking it freely makes that very well written, or all the effort that you've put in and the creative juices you've had used to create a sermon makes it possible for it to be understood and received in a much better and more powerful way. So you have these 2 creative things going on. And so in these 2 lectures, I want to talk about creating the sermon in the writing of it. When you write for an extemporaneous presentation, there are a few things that are a little different, but not a lot different. There's not a great deal of difference between the way you would write a sermon that you're going to preach extemp or a sermon that you have typically simply read to the people. But there are a few things. And one of them that I want to focus on in this first lecture is the writing of a purpose statement. It's extremely important when we are writing a sermon for an extemporaneous delivery, that we know what the purpose is, that we know what the focus of the sermon is going to be. And so this is where I believe our writing begins. It begins with focusing on a purpose, and that's what I want to do in this lecture today. Many homileticians and speech professionals have been agreeing on this a great deal lately. Hugh Litchfield, a speech professional, says this in his book, Secrets of Dynamic Communication. I believe so strongly in the power of focus, I'm convinced that any concerted effort to keep a sermon confined to a single objective will dramatically improve communication, even if that is the only effort made. I'm equally convinced that the lack of such effort does more to destroy communication than any other single factor. People realize that you need to have some kind of focus if your presentation is going to have any real meaning to people. How do we write a purpose statement? Well, writing a purpose statement comes out of all the work that you do in preparation to write a sermon of any kind. And this is the exegetical study, historical study, all of these things that you do prior to beginning to write a sermon. And this is where you're going to find some ideas. Thomas Long puts it this way when he says, in this process of exegetical study, you follow hunches, you explore possible avenues of meaning, and you put clues together. This is what happens when we not only do exegetical study on our own, but sometimes we follow through with that in a text study with other pastors and so on. And here we're doing the same thing, just following hunches, learning things about the text and the historical context, sometimes using the original languages and getting ideas from there. So, but one of the things that I discovered that I'd like to share with you is that when you're doing this, it really helps to have one other person doing it with you. What I did in my last 8 or 9 years of being in the pulpit every Sunday was I found a person who had the same task as I did. He preached every Sunday. And we would get together after we had done our own individual exegetical study on the text, maybe even attended a text study. Middle of the week or so, we would get together on the phone, or we would get together in our offices and talk one-on-one. And we would focus on the text and try to figure out what it was we wanted to get at in this particular text for that Sunday, and share some of the ideas we've come up with. And then at the very end, we would come up with a purpose statement, and we would write a purpose statement, and we would both use that purpose statement as we would go forward in preparing our own individual sermons for the coming Sunday. It was interesting that sometimes we would get together after, or we would talk after we preached the sermon on a Sunday or shortly after that, and we would share what we had said and found out that we had gone in sometimes very different directions in our own writing of the sermon, but we had the same purpose in mind and the same focus in mind. And it works because when you're just dealing with one person, you have to be involved. You have to be totally connected to that person. And so it's just so much better than if you're in a text study or something like that. You can kind of drift away. You don't have to be thinking about it. But one-on-one, you have to be connected all the time. And it really helps to get focused for writing a purpose statement and a sermon in general. I suppose you could get by without writing a purpose statement. You could just be thinking when you're writing your sermon about what the purpose is and have it in mind. But actually putting it down on paper, I think is extremely important for a couple of reasons. It's a creative process, just like writing is a creative process. Writing a purpose statement is a creative process. And so when you're writing it, you juices start flowing and you get some ideas going, and that carries over to the writing of your sermon as well. And then also, when you're writing a purpose statement, you have it available to you during the writing process. I always, at the top of the first page of my sermon manuscript, I would always write my purpose statement. And then I would make an extra copy of that and pin it up on the screen of my computer, so that everything that I put into my sermon was sort of judged by that purpose statement. Was I working towards the fulfilling of a purpose, or did I just find a story that I liked and it doesn't have any relationship to the purpose that I'm trying to get at in this sermon? And the purpose can be very specific. It can be somewhat general. There can be more than one purpose maybe for a sermon, but those things we'll discuss as we talk about writing the purpose statements. Also, most homileticians agree now that there should be two statements rather than one. It helps to have two of these statements. The first one would be a more general statement, and the second statement would be more specific. Hugh Litchfield speaks of them as objectives, and he calls the general objective the city and the more specific objective the house. Thomas Long, he uses the terms focus and function. And Ken Davis calls them the central theme and the proposition. I chose to come up with my own names for these statements. I call them the faith statement, which is the general statement, and the purpose statement, which is the more specific statement getting at what you are actually trying to accomplish in a sermon. This faith statement I want to talk about first is very easy to do and does not take a lot of time, and shouldn't. It just gets you sort of in the ballpark. It's just a general statement about what is the sermon is going to be about. I've developed a formula for these statements. Having a formula, a written formula, a sentence that's already started for you and helps in the writing of these things. So I hope you will jot down these statements so that you will be able to use them regularly when you're writing these statements. The faith statement is worded like this, that the people of, and here you would fill out whoever you're speaking to. The people of Calvary was a church I served in my last parish. So all these that I'll be reading use the word Calvary. So that the people of Calvary be a people who. That's it. Now, you describe in that blank what the people will be like. For example, that the people of Calvary will be a people who pray, people who evangelize, a people who find joy in life. So it's just a very simple, general statement. And it's not something you spend a lot of time on. It is, however, very important. And just writing out a general statement about what your sermon is going to be about helps you when it comes to writing the purpose statement, and helps also when you come to preaching the sermon. So then how do you write a purpose statement? Purpose statement is much more difficult. When I teach this in a class, I have sheets that I give the students so they can follow along. They have a statement, how formula sheet, and some such suggested verbs and so on, faith and purpose statement examples. It's a little hard to do this without you having these things before you, but I will give it a shot, so to speak, to just kind of maybe give you enough information that you can start out and get the idea of how you write a purpose statement. There's certain principles that hold true for a purpose statement, and there are three principles. The first is that it's got to be worded with the audience in mind that you're going to be speaking to, whether it's the congregation on a Sunday morning, or children in a children's sermon, or maybe you're speaking at the conference meeting. Whatever it is, those individuals to whom you're addressing this need to be mentioned in the first part of your purpose statement. I'll share that with you in a moment. Also in the purpose statement, it needs to be worded in terms that are specific, and we'll get at that. And then also it needs to be something that's attainable. And so these are just things to keep in mind, which are, and it helps when you have this formula to get at those things. So the formula statement is, after this sermon, the blank congregation, the children, the parish pastors, the community, whatever it is you're speaking to, after this sermon, the congregation will. In other words, they will do something. They will believe something. They will understand something. There are basically three different purposes for a sermon. The purposes would be to persuade, to inspire, or to inform. And each of these has its own verbs that you would use. For example, if you were going to preach a sermon that would be an inspirational sermon, you might say, after this sermon, the congregation will be pleased, will be excited, will be happy, something like that. Or if you wanted to persuade the congregation, you might say, after this sermon, the congregation will believe, they will understand, they will accept They will, after this sermon, the congregation will know or realize. So there are these verbs, and I have a whole list of these verbs, but for the various kinds of sermon, whether it's a persuasive one, an inspirational one, or maybe one that's just meant to inform. For example, if it was a sermon just meant to inform, it might be, after this sermon, the congregation will be able to define, will be able to describe, that type of thing. So, these statements, this purpose statement then, begins in this way. After the sermon, the congregation will. It will be, and then there's an adverb. Will, it either will or will be, and then the verb that you choose to use. And it, as I say, it has to be then specific. There has to be some specific thing that you want the people to do. You want them to pray. Maybe you want them to tithe or something like that. But being specific is difficult for sermons, because the world of faith is a little more difficult to describe or to talk about compared to other things in life. For example, you think of if an engineer was asked to give a speech on how a hydrogen engine works. And if he knows how it works, he could write a purpose statement very simply. It would say, after this speech, the audience will know how a hydrogen engine works. And then it's easy for that person, because he knows how it does, to write that. Whereas for us, it's a little more obtuse, or it's just a little more harder to be as specific. But all the more reason to try and be specific. And as I give you some examples of purpose statements that I've written in the past, you'll see that I try to be as specific as I can. It also, as I mentioned, has to be an attainable goal for the sermon. You can't have a purpose statement, for example, that says, after this sermon, the congregation will tithe. Everyone in the congregation will tithe. I don't think that'll work. So what can you do? What would your purpose rather be in a tithing sermon? After this sermon, the congregation will consider tithing, and maybe add some more to that, and see how it is possible to do, and that kind of thing. Depending upon the category, as I mentioned, that you choose, each category would have a specific group of verbs that go with it. So that when you have, and I'll give you some of the most common ones. Believe, understand, accept, realize, know, see, remember, welcome, ask, and so on. Those are the most common ones that I've used in sermons, writing sermon purpose statements. So sometimes looking at those verbs helps kind of prime the pump for what you want to say in a particular sermon. I will now share with you a few purpose statements and just comment on them briefly. For example, if you were going to write a purpose statement for Trinity Sunday, the faith statement would be that the people of Calvary be Trinitarian Christians. Simple. Basically, gets you in the ballpark. Now the purpose statement. After this sermon, the congregation will understand why it is that we believe in and teach the doctrine of the Trinity. Now I'm sure as I read that purpose statement to you, right away you're starting to think about what you could say about the Trinity. You've got examples, you've got certain ways in which you talk about the Trinity, things that you know, things you could look up, illustrations. And so it's very helpful to just have that down. Here's one for the third Sunday after Pentecost. These are ones that I did when I was in the parish. A faith statement that the people of Calvary be a people who witness to their faith, become witnesses. The purpose statement was, after this sermon, the congregation will realize that every Christian can and should witness to the gospel. In other words, they have a responsibility to do it. How they do it, and so on, can be added in the sermon. Or Pentecost Sunday. Faith statement that the people of Calvary be a people who know about the power of the Holy Spirit. And a purpose statement might be, after this sermon, the congregation will realize that the Holy Spirit is a mighty spirit of power, and that it empowers them to do mighty acts. I'd like to go back and read that sermon. I wonder what I said about that. But that's an example of what a purpose statement can do. It can just prime the pump, it can get you going, and it becomes the main focus of what you write. To begin writing a sermon without a purpose and without a focus is just so difficult. But once you have the purpose down and have this in front of you, then all of a sudden writing becomes much easier. You know exactly where you're going. It's easy to skimp on this process of writing a purpose statement. But don't. Remember that if you write a purpose statement, in some cases you almost have the sermon written. For example, in a children's sermon, when you write a purpose statement for a children's sermon, you pretty much have the sermon written right there, because you know just exactly what you want to say. And then it's just a matter of writing it out. Once a purpose statement is written, you're on your way to start writing. I once had a student who told me that her purpose statements were very helpful to her other worship planners and so on. And she would try to work ahead a little bit, maybe a couple Sundays ahead, on her purpose statements. And then she would give those purpose statements to her musicians and so on. And it would enable them, even her Sunday school people, and it would enable them to help emphasize a certain theme for the whole Sunday in the music and in all the rest of it. So purpose statements can be very helpful. It's hard for me in this kind of a setting to describe it very well, but I hope that what I've said helps you a little bit. And I know if you use that formula, after this sermon, the congregation will. It will get you started in writing purpose statements that can make a big difference in not only the process of writing, but in the process of delivering the sermon as well. So next time we'll talk about the process of actually writing out the sermon.